Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. I am extremely pleased to be here. Of course, this conference is very dear to me. It's very dear to my heart. It comes within this project, that this kind of like dream that Gualtiero and I drummed together. So I'm really happy, couldn't be happier to see this conference coming together, and especially bringing people together from all parts of the world. So what I thought that I would do in my talk would be that I would give an overview of the free energy principle, mostly thinking about different pathways that you can take within the free energy principle, and keeping in mind that I wanted it to be accessible and interesting to everyone, regardless of their stage of their career, so that it would be accessible and interesting for everybody from the most early career stages to most senior people. So in order for us to start to talk about the free energy principle, or understand the free energy principle, I know that many in the room, of course, are already very acquainted with it. Some are not, so we're going to go over that. In order to start talking about the free energy principle, we can start by a very general question, which, by the way, it's a question that you find in cognitive science, is not particular to the free energy principle. And it is also worth saying that the free energy principle is not something that is peculiar or reducible to cognitive science. But once we want to navigate the potential of the free energy principle within cognitive science, then one starts with the question of the very general question of cognitive science: how do we understand living behavior? So then we can start by looking at our natural world and looking at living behavior, at life, right? And there are a few things that we observe. We observe that are continuous challenges for the living beings to precisely maintain a certain delicate equilibrium between order and chaos. And in order for them to maintain that kind of equilibrium, they must adapt to this ever shifting environment. And to do so, they strategically act by responding to those changes, and they do so by minimizing entropy, and by doing so, they ensure their survival. So, of course, this is very much in a nutshell. So then, as we observe these conditions of living, then we ask what would be a potential solution for us to understand cognitive behavior given those observed conditions. So then a potential solution is presented in the literature as the free energy principle. And the free energy principle comes with something, a claim that some might say that is a big claim, right? And it is a big claim in the sense that it claims to offer a unifying theory from cells to agent level experience or psychological behavior. And that's a lot to cover right there, right? So it can be, that's precisely why some people might say it's quite a big claim. There are two key components to the free energy principle. One is predictive coding, the other one is active inference. You can find some interesting literature, for example, on predictive coding in this particular paper, or you can find the relationships between the free energy principle and active inference, particularly in this other paper right here. Now, there have been a few fields of application for the free energy principle, and I will name just a few, just to give an idea of to those people that are not acquainted or have not come across to the free energy principle yet. So some of the applications very early on in 2013 were, and still are, neurobiology, for example, in this seminal paper, Life as We Know It. More recently, other applications are in neuroscience, where you have, for example, these two papers. There's a bunch more of papers, but here you can see these are two papers that where we applied the free energy principle or Markov blankets in the brain to understand neural activity. More applications of it are psychology, and there's too much to even cover here. I just bring here an illustration of you can apply it to learning, you can apply it to social cognition, for example. More recent applications have been applied to artificial intelligence. And this is something that you can see that this team in this particular paper has been working on more recently to precisely address an increasingly important problem in artificial intelligence, which is known as the explainability in AI. Which is the problem to know how AI makes decisions, the decision-making processes in AI, which are quite opaque. And finally, another one that is, I think, worth mentioning is the free energy principle applied to ecosystems, where you can find, for example, in these two papers. So the point being that you can apply the free energy principle to anything that is an open system that does not need to be or is not exclusive to cognitive science. Now, there are two ways in which you can understand the free energy principle. There's the high road and the low road. And this is something that Carl Friston has talked about a few years back, and I was really happy to see this mapping or this graph in the most recent book in Active Inference, to put it in that way, which I find it's much more interesting, and it does help us understand and put away or dissipate a lot of confusion around understanding the free energy principle, and confusion that typically comes together with, or it comes formulated in the philosophy literature as instrumentalism versus realism. So I think that this way of understanding the various ways or the two parts to the free energy principle is a little bit more useful, and then you can do the philosophy of science, interesting stuff as well on top of that. So what I'm going to do today with you is precisely, I'm going to rehearse with you the two roads, and I'm going to do a little bit of argumentation for why I think the high road is more interesting from a philosophy of mind perspective. So the low road starts and begins with predictive coding. And what is predictive coding? Predictive coding is a statistical strategy or tool that we have developed in computational neuroscience in order to understand or make sense of the activity in the brain. I am going to, like I said, I'm going to first describe the low road, and then I'm going to focus on the high road to do a little bit of argumentation as to why I think it's more interesting. So coming back to recalling that the question that is driving us and brings us to even consider the free energy principle here is because we want to understand how cognitive behaviors come by or come around or occur. We want to get some epistemic virtue about cognitive behavior. So we bring in active inference, we bring in the free energy principle. Now, when we want to do that and answer that question from the point of view of the low road, what happens is that the question that is going to be somewhat setting up the stage and the direction of our investigation is a question that comes more or less with some variation, more or less in the following terms. How does the brain infer the world state of affairs such that a full-bodied organism can adapt to that ever-changing environment? And the low road to active inference is very close to more traditional analytic philosophy of mind that we know as being the computational theory of mind. And the low road to active inference is very compatible with different computational theories of mind. And here I just attempted to kind of encapsulate, because of course there's nuance. So I tried to encapsulate what most of the computational theory of mind theories would kind of like converge on the argument for that particular view of the brain. So one can go with, if minds do not have access to the world, they must build predictive computational models of the world. Brains or minds do not have access to the world, therefore minds are computational predictive models. And here, of course, we needed to be a little bit charitable, because trying to encapsulate the different very rich literature within an argument. But once you are in this kind of like path of understanding cognition, then it does set you into a certain kind of adventure, theoretical adventure or endeavor, which is to ask the question about, okay, if minds are computational predictive models of whatever kind, then the question, the follow-up question, or the question that should set out our research is, how does the brain infer the world's state of affairs in order to adapt to that ever-changing world? And then we find different ways of answering or navigating that challenge. We find predictive coding in the form of prediction error minimization, we find radical predictive processing, and we find active inference. And while they will converge in a main view, or in a main principle, so to speak, they differ in the ways in which they understand or conceptualize cognition. So, for example, in the case of predictive coding, prediction error minimization, cognition comes down to the brain. So cognition occurs in the brain. And we see this more specifically in the theory developed by Jakob Hui, where it is quite clear that the mind can then be understood in internalist solipsistic terms, throwing away the body, the world, and other people. And then we have the more radical proposal, which comes, for example, from Andy Clark. And why is it radical? It is radical in comparison to predictive coding or prediction error minimization. And why is it radical? Well, it is radical because in this predictive processing account, you bring in, or you call in, the body to play a causal role in the predictive processing mechanisms. So, for example, in radical predictive processing, you read that action, which of course takes place with the body, here serves perception by moving the body and sense organs around in ways that aim to serve up predictive patterns of simulation. So what is happening in here is that in radical predictive processing, the understanding of the body is that it does play a causal role in cognition, such that the body is understood in terms of a weak embodiment. So it's nothing to do with the embodiment that we hear about from Merleau-Ponty or phenomenology or e-cognition. The body here, and in this paper it becomes quite clear, it is really spelled out in ways that the body is more prediction. So the body is part of this predictive machine, because the predictive machine does not reduce to the brain as in predictive coding. And then we have active inference, and what makes active inference slightly different is that active inference brings in the environment to play a causal or a fundamental role in this brain-body interaction. And then what you have is cognition can be understood as literally active inference, or as this brain-body environment coupling can be understood as a literal case of organisms from cells or from neurons to fully bodied agents engaging in active inference. And here you find the room to bring in a realist perspective of active inference, if you will. So what does, so they differ, these different approaches, these different theories, they do differ in the ways in which they conceptualize cognition. What really unites them is that all of these approaches will converge in the view that cognition is a computational process of the form of encapsulated inference systems that need to infer the world. So then the low road to active inference, we can sum that up as the claim being brains are predictive computational machines. And of course, then you're going to define cognition depending on how you see fit. And for that reason, if that is the case, then what we need to look for as we set up our experimental designs and our computational models is to answer questions about how does the brain infer the world state of affairs in order such that we see the systems adapting to an ever-changing world. All right, so then I want to put pressure a little bit on the computational theories or views of the mind, right? And putting a little bit of a bracketing here without moving forward yet to the high road to active inference. We come from this like computational theory of mind, where we find different very rich literature, different very rich theories that take the brain to be computational. And I want to dispute that a little bit with you. And I want to ask what computation is. It is quite relevant, and I don't think that we can get past that until we answer that question. It may very well be the case that cognition is computation, but we need to kind of like answer, and that's where the literature becomes very, very, very rich with many different accounts. But I want to put a little bit of a challenge to those accounts and tell you what I think computation is and why I think that cognition is not computation itself. So if one is confronted with the question of what is computation, right, and one needs to answer that question, then I will have a go and I will say that computation is manipulation of numerical and logical structures. And that particular kind of activity allows us to make inferences and comprehend causal relationships that we see as we navigate and observe our worlds. And we have been engaging in that for a long time. For example, with abacus, which are tools that we as a species, as communities, as epistemic communities have developed to help us and assist us in precisely doing this manipulation of numerical and logical structures. Why? Well, because we want to understand something in the natural world. Other examples of that are Turing machines. Other examples are more sophisticated as we develop more sophisticated computational capacity and models. So, for example, a model of a black hole would be a highly sophisticated computational machinery or strategy. Or even more recently, what we have as these predictive models or these predictive modeling techniques underlying large language models, right? So these are examples for me of what computation is, this manipulation of numerical and logical structures. So these are kinds of things that we have to engage with the world in order for us to feel the urge and the need to make those, to develop those strategies. So they are part of our scientific, but also our daily practices. And they are not this kind of manipulation of numerical and logical structures and the objects and tools that we developed on the basis of that, they are not independent of our own scientific or even daily practices. So what I'm saying is that we cannot find computation in the wild. We cannot find computation, or computation is not something that exists independently of our own full agent capacities doings, right? So what I want to say here is that from the fact that we can manipulate, we can engage with the manipulation of numerical and logical structures in order to make sense of this observed natural world, it does not follow that cognitive behaviors themselves are computational in character. So that's the kind of argument that I'm after. So what I'm saying is that there is no computation in the wild. There is a set of criteria for computation to come about and around in the world. And that has to do with computation being a product of human cognitive behavior. But not only that, right? There is more to that. For computation to come around and about, we need to have a fully embodied agent. We also need that agent to have been symbolically enculturated with certain symbolic skills and tools. And we need that to be a continuous skill that develops the more the agent interacts with the social cultural environment. And here, just a call out to the fact that human cognitive development does not occur in an encapsulated way, but we already infants come to the world in a very already cultural setting. And that's when this symbolic enculturation starts, and with development, we become ever more skilled. So what I'm saying is that computational capacity is a skill that is developed, and it can be developed for us to go around and about and do our own mundane tasks and understand the natural world and the world around us. Or it can be the case that we become scientists and contribute, co-construct with our scientific practices ever more powerful and sophisticated computational systems. And I think that Einstein was very much kind of like bringing out this kind of like understanding, or this kind of like thinking that I'm trying to bring out here. So when he says something like, it is certain that mathematics generally, and particularly geometry, owes its existence to, and here I dare add, socioculturally situated need, which was felt, of learning something about the relations of things to one another. So what he's saying here is that this mathematical capacity, this capacity to make inferences, to make computations, is something that does not exist in the wild, but it comes out of the necessity of us as human beings that engage with the world and see problems that require certain kinds of solutions. Then we want to connect real things with the world in an epistemic way. Therefore, that's how mathematics comes about. That's how computation comes about. And I think that this is also very in line with what Catherine Elgin also is more or less about in True Enough, where here she specifies this. So of course, I'm talking about computation. And here, Catherine is specifying it in terms of computational models. And she says that many scientists are aware of this particular phenomenon, which is why many refer to the computational models as viable models. When we have models of, for example, the brain activity, and these models output or give us the kinds of explanations that we would not have before if we had not built that computational model, then we have a very viable model as opposed to an accurate or true model. And here, of course, there's a lot of very good philosophy of science to be done about accurate and true models. I'm going to leave that aside, but I think it is useful for, or to the point that our computational models do not exist in the wild. They're not independent from our own doings as scientists and from our own doings and bringing them about. The idea here is that computational models, even of the brain or of cognition, they are not ontology prescribers. They are viable and they allow us the opportunity to learn something about cognition, about the brain, and ideally to make predictions about future states of cognition or the brain. So I will bring out, and I'm almost wrapping this up and going into the high road to active inference, but not before I make a stop into this brilliant work by Karen Barrett, where she's telling us about tools. And I dare here add computational models are not mere tools waiting to be picked up and used by human agents, but rather they are material discursive practices that play a role in shaping and co-constituting the world in which we live. And I think that really encapsulates the thought that I'm also pursuing here, the approach that I'm also pursuing, which is these computational models are these lenses through which we are going to look to the world, try to explain it, and in doing so, we contribute to the scientific world, we co-construct in a scientific practice the scientific world. Okay, so then this brings us up to a modus ponens, and that goes as follows. If models are tools to understand and predict living behavior, then living behavior is not the same kind or of the same kind as those modeling tools. And then I say that models are tools to understand living behavior, which leads us to the modus ponens conclusion that living behavior is not of the same kind as our modeling tools. So then, from this point on, I would say that living behavior is not computational in character. Okay, so these are the reasons that I present why I do not think that the low road, or I do not find the low road as interesting as the high road. So the high road has and begins with a different kind of question that I find much more appealing. And the question is, how do living beings persist and adapt in an ever-changing environment? So the argument for the high road can be made roughly as follows. If living beings are open systems, active inference is a suited epistemic framework. Living beings do not want to dissipate. They do not want to increase entropy or chaos. That's the same as saying they are open systems. Therefore, active inference is a suited epistemic framework for organisms, for explaining or understanding organisms' behavior. So once you are taking this theoretical approach, then it leads you to a different kind of question. And the question being, how do living beings persist and adapt in an ever-changing environment? Now you might say, well, that doesn't really tell us all of the stories that there are to tell about or within cognition. I agree, but it will tell us something that I find relevant. So let's see. The burden of proof is going to be in premise number 2. Living beings do not want to dissipate. They do not want to increase entropy or chaos. And how or whether, if at all, active inference is going to be suited to help us understand this. Okay, so I always find it useful to start with the second law of thermodynamics. An open system will tend to dissipation. That's what the law says. And this means dissipation, meaning the increase of surprise, entropy, or chaos. And they will tend to that. And once we ask the question about how do living beings resist this second law, we are already on our way, even though we might be doing some physics or some biology, but we are already asking questions about cognition and behavior, because whatever they are doing precisely to maintain themselves alive, and that's cognitive behavior. And what we find is that typically, and I want to stress typically, because there are exceptions and we can talk about them in Q&A. Typically, as we go around and about the natural world, living beings do not want to die. And that means that however we are going to find living beings in the environment, it is very likely that we find them in a state that is most convenient or close to being most convenient to their survival and adaptation. They will be resisting the second law. Now, there are here 3 important notions in order to understand how and why they are resisting the second law. So they are resisting the second law because first, they are thermodynamically open, so they are prone to the law. But at the same time, there are operationally closed systems. And these 2 features, or these 2 aspects of the systems, launch them immediately into a permanent state of precariousness. And this is very relevant because what it means is that the system must in a very vital way, interact with the environment. And let me say a little bit more about systems being thermodynamically open. That means that they are coupled with their environments, directly exchanging energy and matter with their environments. And this exchange is precisely what enables the system to interact and respond to the environment and adapt to it, and therefore push back against the second law. Without this exchange, without this coupling, the system would dissipate. It would succumb to the second law. So this realization immediately puts us into sort of like rejecting the view of cognition as living beings being encapsulated from their environments. So then systems are also operationally closed. And what that means is that systems from cells all the way to full-bodied agents like us, they maintain homeostasis by virtue of self-organization. And they do that by showing something like a closure or operationally closed to certain perturbations. And I say here certain perturbations because some perturbations would be too much of a perturbation that would launch the system into a phase boundary such as death. But this closure is precisely what allows the system to maintain certain identity and autonomy. So these two aspects launch the system into this state of precariousness, and what that means is that they are on the edge of chaos, and that's precisely why the title of the talk. They are on the edge of chaos, meaning that they must act upon the world to minimize their precariousness, to maintain and remain alive. And this is very vital. There's a vital coupled interaction with the environment precisely to push back that state of precariousness. So then, in order to understand precariousness, the free energy principle becomes one of the possibilities that we can use to understand that precariousness. It allows us, or it helps us to understand patterns in this continuous exchange between the system and the environment. And these patterns can be modeled through active inference as well as through other computational frameworks that we have available. And these patterns can be seen, for example, here we can connect literature with niche construction, as well as meaning making that we do when we engage with tools or with AI, for example. We can here understand that under that banner. Okay, so then the question is, right, active inference is quite interesting and relevant to understand this state of precariousness. How? Well, because it is a first principles approach, it tells us something. It tells us that the organisms must maintain themselves or maintain their existence. And how do they do that? Well, because they tend to preferred states, and they tend to move away from these preferred states. And the preferred states are states that have been defined by niche-specific evolutionary adaptations, and they extend to learned cognitive goals. These preferred states are states that would mean for the system a phase transition such as death. So then from this point on, we can say something. We can say that an organism's action is such that it follows a unique imperative, minimizing the surprise of their sensory observations. So the question then is, what's news? Well, we get something that we didn't have before. And what we get that we didn't have before is we get an imperative. We can say that an organism's action is such that it follows a unique imperative, that to minimize the surprise of their sensory observations. And active inference offers that mathematical solution to surprise minimization. So then we can say that once we have phenomena in the real world, like the real thing, the real deal, we can apply an active inference framework in order to understand those patterns of behavior. And this is precisely where we find ourselves in the high road to the free energy principle. We can understand those patterns of behavior in terms of the minimization of free energy. And how does that come about? Well, because we have this formalism called Markov blankets. And Markov blankets are very interesting and very useful because they are scale-free. We can apply them to the brain, to an organism, to bacteria. And what happens in Markov blankets is that you define as internal states the system that you want to understand that is of scientific relevance to you. And what then you want to know is what are the states that are going to be influential for the state of the system that you are interested in studying. So then you have internal and external states. And these internal and external states, they do not directly influence one another. They are conditionally independent. They influence one another via a second set of states, which is the sensory and the active states. Those are the ones that directly influence one another and allow the coupling to occur. So then, like I said, you can apply that all the way up to anything that is a complex system, anything that is an open system, and most of the things that we know are open systems. But is life only sustenance? And here is where things can become more interesting from the point of view of cognitive science. I don't know if I have much time left. I feel that I'm coming very close to having to wrap this up, but I will make this point from Simone de Beauvoir. Well, she tells us, well, yet, if life is seen as a challenge of entropy, it cannot be more than just this biological sustenance. If all that it does is maintain itself, then living is only not dying, and human existence is indistinguishable from absurd vegetation. So then she tells us, living must be this acting within these crossroads of ambiguity, must be more than being vegetation, must be this being continuously in this negotiation between freedom and facticity, or as she tells us, between objectification and agency, fighting for that agency within a certain social cultural setting. Right, and then this brings us to look into how minds become contentful, and how do we engage with narratives or giving reasons for our own actions as we interact and act and interact in the world with an embodied mind that is beyond the brain. So then this brings us to a wrap, and the discussion is active inference suited to explain cognitive behaviors. To a certain extent it is. Not sufficient, I would say, but to a certain extent this high road is very suited in the sense that the low road is a little bit more limited in explanatory power, because it really puts us and sets us into thinking or looking into how the brain infers the world. And the high road asks questions that I think lead us to much more nuanced and diverse ways of thinking. And it allows us then to set us up into the question of what models best explain how living systems persist and adapt. And then for that, we need philosophical reasoning, and we need empirical research precisely to get to that question. And what we get with the high road is we get to do the big claim that I started off with. We get to maximize the explanatory power of
Is it only me or we lost?
No, it's a problem with Inês, sadly. Inês, can you hear us? We've lost you.
Now, that's a cliffhanger.
Oh, that's a problem, not a cliffhanger. Ugh. Try to write her an email.
Maybe we just contact her via email and ask him to come back, to exit and come back. Because I continue to see, no, she's not anymore in the participant list. So I mean, that's me.
Well, so she knew, she knows.
So in the meantime, I took the occasion to explain participants how to join the parallel session after the end of Inês talk. So we can gain minutes after the talk. So there's a list. This is the main room, and then there's a list of parallel sessions that you have to join in order to have, talks after the end of the keynote. How to join parallel session? Well, you should see at the right of your WebEx windows a list of participants. If you cannot see the list of participants, just see at the bottom of your page, that's icon participant, just click on it. At the top of this list of names, you should see a blue button, show all breakout sessions. Perhaps I can share also the slides. Okay, that's.
Can you hear
Inês.
me? I'm
Yeah,
so
great.
sorry. This is the thing with Australia, is that the connection to Wi-Fi is not always the best.
No problem, no problem.
So sorry about that. Okay,
problem.
so I'll just continue. I was just about to wrap anyway. Okay. So as I was saying, with a high row, what you get more for your money, so to speak. You get the maximization of the explanatory power. You get to say that it is indeed, it can be applied to understand the causal influences from cells to artificial intelligence to neuroscience to ecosystems in a way that is not as limited as the low road, because it really comes to predictive coding strategies or framework in which is really just about the brain. So then you do get the maximization of that explanatory power. Now, I want to also draw your attention to another quite relevant, or at least I find relevant from the epistemic point of view, is that active inference becomes quite interesting to precisely capture these two aspects of that we observe in open systems, in living systems like us or like cells, which is the two aspects we mentioned, which is the operationally closed and thermodynamically open, right? So on the one hand, you have the operationally closed system, which is what maintains the coherence of the system. And that you can think of that as the conditionally independent states, such as the internal and the external states. And that really nicely captures the conditional independency. And then you also have this other aspect that we talked about, that, well, on the one hand, the system is operationally closed, but on the other hand, it is also thermodynamically open. And that is very nicely captured by the active and the sensory states, in which case what you get is the system is directly influenced by the external environment by virtue of the balanced interaction between these active and sensory states. So this kind of like active inference formalism with this Markov blankets formalism allows us to capture operationally closed and thermodynamically open in a way that what we get is to model precariousness. So we get to model this precariousness at the various scales of lives, from cells to ecosystems. And my concluding remarks are that if it is the case that living systems are in this state of precariousness because they're both closed and open, then promoting real-world explorations of the environment, then engaging in these real world, and therefore they are engaging in these real-world explorations of the environment for survival and adaptation, then for sure we as scientists will see some patterns of them trying to precisely adapt to the world, to precisely push back on or counteract this precariousness, right? So then we find those coupling behavior that the system must be found at, otherwise it's not an open system. And it is precisely at this point that I would say that I don't see reasons to think of living beings as encapsulated computations or disembodied computations. I don't see any epistemic reason to pursue that approach of thinking. And then the free energy principle becomes here relevant because the high road of it allows us to model a living system that is both thermodynamically open as well as operationally closed. So in that sense, it can be a suited framework to understand living systems' precariousness. Now, As a conclusion, I would say that the free energy principle holds scientific promise, but we need to be cautious in the sense that its suitability depends on rigorous reasoning, so philosophical reasoning, and empirical validation by developing very situated experimental designs in order to precisely test all of these theories and formalisms. And this is it for me. Thank you so much for your attention and being here so early.